Today, we're traveling across New York, a state as complex as its city skyline. From sleepy small towns to the 24/7 buzz of the city, we're sharing the stories that got people talking and exploring what it means to be in a New York state of crime. Viewer discretion is advised.
I went up to her doorstep with a loaded gun in my pocket. I proceeded to talk to Mrs. Buttafuoco. She turned around to walk away. I hit her on the back of the head. I went to hit her again, and the gun went off.
Amy Fisher was born August 24th, 1974, and grew up in a modest home in Wantagh, New York. Located on the South Shore of Long Island, it was a neighborhood of blue-collar families that worked hard to make ends meet. But when she was 13, her family moved to Merrick. While only a few miles away, it seemed worlds apart. She found herself in a new environment of wealth and privilege, where doctors and lawyers lived in big houses and drove fancy cars. Growing up in the 80s, mothers were joining the workforce in increasing numbers and childcare options were limited. This gave rise to the latchkey kid, a child who returns to a vacant home after school, which was typical for Gen X kids.
These latchkey children wait home alone for mom and dad.
Because their parents were at work, they were left with no supervision. Kids could easily avoid the consequences of their poor decisions. Teenagers tend not to think before they act or consider the consequences of their actions. The frontal lobe is the part of the brain that controls decision-making, impulse control, sensation-seeking, emotional responses, and consequential thinking. It does not fully mature until early adulthood. Because their brains are still developing, teenagers are more likely to act on impulse, get confused by social cues and emotions, and engage in dangerous or risky behavior. But shooting the wife of your 36-year-old lover is hardly a normal case of adolescent angst. Amy's father tried to give Amy everything she wanted or needed. In an effort to blend in and become part of the new upper-class area they moved to, Amy received a car on her 16th birthday. Amy first encountered Joey Buttafuoco in the summer of 1991 when she brought that new car into his auto body shop. She had accidentally ripped off the side mirror and was scared of her father's reaction. Joey allegedly helped her concoct a cover story about being hit by a car at the mall, saving her from getting in trouble. Whenever she visited the shop, he gave her attention and compliments, making her feel valued and loved. Amy saw Joey as a rich, handsome man who could make her happy. She believed he was the best thing that had ever happened to her. Amy has described the relationship as romantic, claiming that Joey professed his love for her and expressed how he wanted to get rid of his wife. Amy became infatuated with Joey, and she would do anything he asked her to. Mary Jo Buttafuoco was at her home in Massapequa, Long Island, on May 19, 1992, when a young woman knocked on the front door. Mary Jo opened the door, not suspecting a thing, maybe Girl Scouts selling cookies. Amy Fisher told the woman her name was Anne Marie. She said that her 16-year-old sister was having an affair with Mary Jo's husband. Mary Jo was skeptical, so Amy showed her a t-shirt from the auto body shop, saying that she found it in her sister's bedroom. Mary Jo didn't buy it. She said in a dismissive tone, "I'll tell him you stopped by," and turned around to shut the door behind her. That's when Amy removed the gun she had been holding in her pocket. She had bought the .25 caliber semi-automatic handgun a few days earlier from her friend Peter. He had agreed to be her getaway driver and was waiting in his car a few doors down. Amy maintains that she only intended to hit Mary Jo with the gun and that it went off accidentally. Mary Jo was shot in the head and collapsed on the steps of her home. Neighbors called 911 upon hearing the shot. Amy and Peter fled, dumping the car's license plates and the gun down a storm drain. They were gone before the cops or paramedics arrived. The bullet entered Mary Jo's right cheek and passed through her neck, leaving her critically injured. Upon arrival at the hospital, doctors worked to stabilize her condition. They performed a lengthy 9-hour operation, to repair her carotid artery, and she was on a ventilator for several days. The bullet remains lodged near her spine to this day. The presence of the bullet near such a sensitive area made its removal risky, so the doctors made the decision to leave it in place. In addition to hearing loss, Mary Jo also had facial paralysis, which caused one side of her face to droop. The police eagerly waited to see when Mary Jo would eventually recover enough to tell them what had happened. When she did, she told them about the girl and the t-shirt. The police asked Joey about the t-shirt, and he said he had only given one out recently, to a girl called Amy Fisher. He claimed he didn't really know her well and that she was just a customer. He offered to try to contact Amy, and the police were able to track her down. They placed her under arrest and charged her with attempted second-degree murder, first-degree assault, and multiple firearms-related felonies. The term Lolita typically refers to an attractive young woman who engages in relationships with older men. In Fisher's case, the media adopted the label Long Island Lolita to capture the sensationalized aspects of her involvement with Joey Buttafuoco, an older married man. The news coverage surrounding Amy Fisher's case was extensive due to the scandalous nature of the story. A teenage girl engaging in a sexual relationship with a married man, culminating in a violent attack on his wife. The portrayal of Fisher as a seductive, manipulative teenager fueled the tabloid media. Amy maintained that she had been in a relationship with Joey, and that he knew of her plans and encouraged her to kill his wife. Joey dismissed these allegations, as did Mary Jo.
She defends her husband of 20 years, the father of her 2 young children.
Within a week of Amy's arrest, a man called Peter DeRosa contacted the tabloid TV show A Current Affair. He claimed that Amy was an escort and he could prove it. He secretly videotaped one of their encounters where he paid her $100 before having sex. He was paid $7,500 for the tape, and when it aired, it sparked a massive controversy. It was broadcast on national television the night before Amy's bail hearing. Her bail was set at $2 million. At the time, it was the highest bail ever in the county's history. Despite her attorney's efforts, the judge refused to lower the bail. Amy's parents used all their assets as collateral, but it still wasn't enough to secure her freedom. To raise the rest of the money, her lawyer persuaded Amy to sell her story to a production company. This caused a public outcry due to the perceived violation of the Son of Sam law. This is a law that prevents convicted criminals in the United States from profiting from their crimes through books or movie deals. However, Amy was charged, not convicted, and in the United States, the accused are innocent until proven guilty. Therefore, it was well within Amy's rights to do this. She later said that this was a bad decision made under pressure from her lawyer, and that the movie and book that had resulted from this deal were filled with falsehoods. In the meantime, the Buttafuocos were also inking book and movie deals and making a lot of television appearances, drawing massive attention wherever they went. It was the analog version of going viral. Her defense attorney maintained that Joey took advantage of her vulnerable state as a young teenager and engaged in a sexual relationship with her, despite being aware of her age. He argued that she had been emotionally manipulated by a man 20 years her senior, and that he was behind her employment as a call girl. That Joey had introduced her to the business and even got a cut of her fees. He had often remarked to Amy about how much he hated his wife and wanted her gone, and there was evidence proving that he paid for their many visits to cheap motels. Amy's attorney was able to secure a plea deal where Amy would plead guilty to the assault charge and the others would be dropped. This would avoid a lengthy trial that would be sure to be a media feeding frenzy. But the storm was far from over. Right before the sentencing, a show called Hard Copy aired hidden camera footage of Amy speaking with her friend Paul. In the tape, she could be heard saying, "I want my name in the press. Why? Because I can make a lot of money. I figure if I'm going through all of this pain and suffering, I'm getting a Ferrari." She later wrote in a book that this conversation was engineered by Paul. She claimed he was given questions to ask and instructed to ask them in a way that would prompt responses, which the show could cut together out of context. When Amy saw the tape, she made an attempt on her own life and was brought to a psychiatric hospital. The DA publicly stated that they would not be pursuing any charges on Joey Buttafuoco for the statutory rape of Amy Fisher. Amy pled guilty to the first-degree assault charges and was sentenced to 5 to 15 years in prison. The DA's office changed their mind about bringing charges against Joey once Amy was convicted. Joey was charged with 19 criminal charges, including statutory rape, sodomy, and endangering the welfare of a minor. Joey had initially denied any wrongdoing, but he later accepted a plea deal. He admitted that he had sexual relations with Fisher when she was 16 and that he was aware of her age. He received a 6-month jail sentence, but was released after serving 4 months. According to Amy, she had a very difficult time in prison. The guards would be extra hard on her to knock her down a few pegs, thinking she was some rich celebrity type being on TV. They would urinate in her food and give her rotten milk, leaving her to go hungry. She would sometimes get some scraps from other inmates who felt sorry for her. She would inform her defense attorney, who would object to the prison, and then they would confine her in protective custody, which meant being locked up for 23 hours a day. The facility would provide everyone with the opportunity to watch the 3 made-for-TV movies about her case, and this caused a lot of unwanted attention for her.
Hey, what are these?
We had them made up for our best customers. Yeah, take one. You're definitely on our top 10 hit list.
Thanks.
Amy was transferred to another prison that was slightly less awful than the previous one, but still a living hell. Then she made a connection with a guard who showed her some compassion. He would protect her from the other inmates and sometimes flirt with her. She wrote a sincere letter to him, but was caught with it and put in the SHU, the secure housing unit where inmates are isolated. The tabloids ate it up, publishing juicy stories about her, quote, lesbian love affairs and her encounters with multiple guards. In her 2004 book, Amy admits to her relationship with the one guard. She says that she was desperate for any sort of positive attention and that the relationship was inappropriate on his part and naive on hers. She denied having intimate relationships with other prisoners and claims many inmates would band together as girlfriends so that they could protect one another. She says the reports of her relations with guards were all non-consensual. Her mother, Rose, visited her and smuggled her underwear out after Amy informed her of these incidents. Rose submitted it to a lab which confirmed male DNA present on the clothing. The guard in question submitted to a blood test, and the DNA matched. He quietly resigned, and there was no further action taken by the prison. Amy and her mother brought a civil suit against the Department of Corrections in 1996. The court ruled against her, saying, Fisher has failed to establish a clear or substantial likelihood of success on her sexual abuse claim. Simply put, after carefully considering the testimony offered at the hearing and other evidence in the record, the court finds that Fisher's claims of rape and sexual abuse are not credible. Neither Fisher nor her mother was a credible witness, and their testimony was contradicted by other witnesses and other evidence in the record. The New York Adult Survivors Act, passed in 2022, has allowed anyone who was abused to seek justice and compensation through the civil justice system, no matter how long ago the abuse occurred. In April 2023, a federal civil lawsuit was filed that accuses the New York State Department of Corrections of failing to protect female inmates from abuse by male staff. Several officers named in the civil suit have been criminally convicted of abuse. A lawyer for the plaintiff said, "The New York State Department of Corrections and Community Supervision has repeatedly allowed the rights of female inmates to be violated by cultivating a culture in which abuse by prison guards and staff persisted for decades. The rising number of assaults implicating correctional officers from Albion Correctional Facility is staggering. Victims of prison abuse are often intimidated into silence because policies to investigate and discipline wrongdoers are not enforced. It's time for this culture of secrecy and silence to end, allowing justice for those who have suffered immeasurable harm by this broken system which has, for far too long, protected abusers more than the abused." Amy returned to court in 1998 with the intention of appealing her conviction. She accuses her former lawyer, Eric Nyberg, of lying to her and having an inappropriate relationship with her. Her new lawyer said that the affair was a conflict of interest and hurt her defense. He said that Mr. Nyberg was more interested in Amy Fisher's sex life than her case. He argued that Mr. Nyberg fooled Amy into pleading guilty by promising her a work release deal that the prosecutors never agreed to. Amy had many poems and letters that she received from Mr. Nyberg while in prison. He would often visit her, chartering a plane from Long Island to the jail, which was near the New York-Canada border. Mr. Nyberg denied everything and said, "I am one of the last of a long line of individuals with whom she has alleged improper conduct." He referenced her allegations of sexual misconduct against 8 prison officers and said, "They were dismissed as being incredible, as will the charges against me." Amy's allegations of abuse in prison later turned out to be a systemic issue. Perhaps her claims regarding her lawyer were not as outlandish as previously thought. A deal was made between the DA and her lawyer that implied Mr. Nyberg's improper behavior without officially admitting it. As a result, her sentence was reduced and she became eligible for parole immediately. Amy wrote an apology letter to Mary Jo, who supported her parole request. She was released in 1999. Everyone involved in this sensational story has faced various consequences and outcomes after the ordeal was over. They have all maintained their public profile over the years and are definitely cashing in on their fame. Everyone has appeared on TV specials and talk shows. Amy's husband even competed with Joey in a celebrity boxing match. All 3 have been guests on The Howard Stern Show, a radio show known for its provocative content, so all the appearances were full of drama and tension. The most sensational episode was in 2008, when Amy was on the show and Mary Jo's daughter Jessie, who was an adult by then, called in and confronted Amy. Amy was so upset that she walked out of the show. Jessie has since become more vocal and involved in the saga. The story has been squeezed for everything it's worth, and TV specials are still being created about it, even as recently as 2019. Mary Jo eventually ended her marriage with Joey, and she continued appearing on TV shows and published a memoir in 2009. With the help of the Oprah Winfrey Show, she underwent surgery to restore her smile. She later remarried and was widowed in 2018. Joey was arrested in 1995 for soliciting an undercover officer who was posing as a prostitute. In 2004, he pled guilty to auto insurance fraud and served 1 year in prison. He is also prohibited from working in the auto repair industry for life. A felony conviction barred him from owning ammunition, but in August 2005, probation officers found some in his home during a search. He did not contest the charge and served 4 months. He married a woman named Ivanka, who, ironically, he had met at his auto body shop. She filed for divorce in 2007, but has since withdrawn the petition. After her release, Amy adopted a new identity and enrolled in college. She tried to alter her appearance by hiding behind big sunglasses and bleaching her hair. She couldn't keep a job for long because she would be exposed by employees who realized who she was. But she was determined to lead a normal life. She says she rejected a $1 million offer from Playboy to pose naked. She eventually saved enough for facial surgery and disappeared for years. She married a retired NYPD officer and had 3 kids with him, but the drama was far from over. Amy's marriage was rocked by a scandal in 2007 when an X-rated tape of her and her husband surfaced. She claimed that her husband, who had briefly separated from her at the time, leaked the tape without her consent.
That's it, up and down the class like that. Oh yeah, like that.
He denied any involvement and said that he was also a victim of the leak. Amy sued the production company that distributed the tape and reached a settlement.
If you get involved in this world, Amy,
I'm not going to be a porn star.
You're not?
Just going to the conventions.
You're not?
She made a few more movies and even became a webcam model. She said she never wanted to be in the adult film industry and only did it because her husband pressured her. He disputed this and said that he's never profited from her career. They got back together after the scandal, but divorced 4 years later. After the divorce, she maintained her cam model career and made guest appearances at strip clubs.
How long was she lying there with her, heart beating?
Oh man, for like 45 minutes.
And what did you do?
I was watching cartoons and smoking joint and just thinking that, wow, she's faking this.
Right in the middle of New York City's lively East Village, Tompkins Square Park has seen a lot of changes over the years. Back in the 60s, when it was known as Needle Park, it was a popular spot for rebels like Timothy Leary to turn on, tune in, and drop out. Then, in the 80s, the park started to go through a dramatic shift. A lot of rich yuppies started moving in, and this pushed out many of the park's homeless folks, some of whom were dealing with mental health issues and addiction. It was 1988, and Daniel Rakowitz, who liked to call himself Jesus, was known around the park as a laid-back guy who sold weed. He really liked the band Missing Foundation, an underground punk group. They were known for their chants of "Die Yuppie Scum" and trashing the venues they played at. Some people thought they were into devil worship, but that wasn't true. The band was like a voice for the people who felt pushed out because the East Village was changing and the rich were moving in. When the band planned a protest, Daniel wanted to be a part of it, ready to fight for the park and the people who hung out there. During the protest, tensions escalated quickly and the situation turned chaotic. Protesters and police clashed, leading to a full-blown riot. In the aftermath, the NYPD acknowledged their mishandling of the event. They admitted that the officers who responded were not properly supervised, were not briefed or prepared for the situation, and many were new recruits with little experience. This lack of preparation and oversight led to officers being charged with using excessive force. The incident became a significant moment in the history of Tompkins Square Park. But the following year, Daniel would make the park even more infamous. Daniel's childhood in Texas was a series of challenging experiences that shaped his early life. He faced psychological issues from a young age and claims to have undergone electroconvulsive therapy at the age of 14. The bullying he endured, coupled with the trauma of witnessing his mother's death from a heart attack, would leave deep emotional scars. His relationship with his father, an authoritarian figure, was strained and filled with conflict. This tension reached a breaking point when his father discovered Daniel's marijuana possession and had him arrested. When he turned 18, Daniel joined the army as a means of escape. But his past conviction would prevent him from pursuing a career as a military police officer. Eventually, Daniel left Texas for the big city, where he began selling weed and hanging out in the parks of Manhattan. In New York City, Daniel's life was a mix of anger and odd behavior. He often ranted about his hatred for the police and his strange plans, like his desire to father lots of children and to start a church in Colorado. He talked about wanting to hurt people, and he was obsessed with the numbers 9 and 6. Daniel moved between apartments and being homeless, and while many thought he was just another crazy person on the street, there were signs of deeper issues. He had a pet rooster that he mistreated, showing a lack of empathy often associated with psychopathy. His former roommates also noticed symptoms of obsessive-compulsive disorder as he displayed repetitive behaviors and fixations. To many, he was just another face in the crowd of the city's homeless population, his erratic behavior dismissed, even described as too crazy to be dangerous. But he turned out to be more than just an eccentric figure in the park. Monica Bierl, originally from Switzerland, moved to the U.S. with dreams of advancing her dance and choreography career. Known for her independent streak and a tendency to break the rules, she began her studies at the Martha Graham School of Dance. While in school, she made a living as an exotic dancer at a couple of clubs. She was always on the move, so when she got an opportunity to move out of a cramped apartment and into a place with her own room, she took it. 700 East 9th Street was where she met Daniel Rakowitz and became his flatmate. At first, Monica saw Daniel as just one of the many quirky characters populating the city, but she would soon find out she was mistaken. Without a formal job, Daniel couldn't sign a lease agreement, so it had to be in Monica's name. Daniel's friends warned him that she might ask him to leave. Daniel saw himself as Monica's boyfriend, but it was clear to everyone else that Monica wanted to keep her distance from him. When she began to bring dates home, Daniel's anger grew. Monica's friends, concerned for her safety due to Daniel's violent threats, urged her to kick him out. Defiantly, she confronted him, saying she would defend herself if necessary, and gave him 2 weeks to move out. But 13 days later, it was Monica who left. In the following days, Daniel would brag to everyone that he had killed Monica, but his history of outlandish statements led others to dismiss it as mere ranting. He even boasted about dismembering her and serving her remains to the homeless, a claim so shocking and bizarre it was beyond belief. But Daniel wasn't just ranting. He had killed Monica, and after Monica's lifeblood had drained away, he meticulously set about his gruesome task. He severed her limbs and dismembered her body, ensuring there was no trace of his heinous act. He flushed some remains down the toilet and boiled the remaining parts clean. Blood stained his hands, but he scrubbed and scrubbed until the bathroom gleamed, erasing any evidence. Gathering her bones, he carefully packed them into a bucket filled with odor-masking kitty litter. He would eventually move away from the East Village, uptown to a new apartment with a new roommate. But in the chaos of his move, he had lost the one thing that tied him to his unspeakable crime, the claim ticket for the storage locker where he had hidden Monica's remains. The rumor would reach the ears of the building's superintendent. Concerned, he reported it to the authorities, prompting an investigation into Monica's disappearance. Daniel was called in for questioning, and when pressed about the possibility of his involvement, he brazenly remarked that if he had committed such an act, he would have disposed of her by flushing her down the toilet. However, upon examination, the pipes revealed no evidence of foul play. As the investigation deepened, more witnesses were interviewed, each adding a piece to the puzzle. One individual claimed to have actually seen Monica's dismembered body in the bathtub. Confronted with mounting evidence and eyewitness testimonies, Daniel would confess to the grisly crime. Daniel admitted that he and Monica had argued on the night of her death, his emotions boiling over at the prospect of being kicked out. He claimed that Monica had come at him with a lead pipe, so he struck her in the throat, unaware of the fatal consequences. He thought she was faking it and sat down to smoke a joint and watch cartoons. He even left the apartment to make a weed deal, and when he came back, she was cold. So he turned to desperate measures, disposing of her remains according to instructions he says he had received from, quote, people who know about these things.
Because they're involved into a special religion that they do a lot of weird things like that.
So you thought to yourself, well, how can I get rid of this body?
Yeah.
As the investigation continued and the trial unfolded, Daniel's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He contradicted himself with each retelling of events. He pointed fingers at his friends Randy and Dave, weaving elaborate tales of their involvement. During the competency phase, the medical experts found him deeply disturbed but still competent to stand trial for murder. Throughout the proceedings, Daniel's outbursts shocked the courtroom. He yelled at the lawyer for the prosecution, saying he would fill a water pistol with urine and spray it in her face. Under oath, a witness would recount a disturbing incident involving a severed finger in a bowl of soup, allegedly served by Daniel. Despite the mounting evidence of his instability, Daniel rejected the suggestion of pleading insanity, fearing it would damage his political ambitions, claiming he would eventually be President of the United States. After 9 days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict, not guilty by reason of insanity. Daniel's response was characteristically brazen, thanking the jury and suggested sharing a joint with them once he was released. However, his fate was sealed as he was remanded to Kirby Forensic Psychiatric Hospital, where he would undergo treatment and evaluation for the foreseeable future. The Kirby Forensic Psychiatric Hospital is a maximum security facility on Ward's Island in New York City. Operated by the New York State Office of Mental Health, Kirby is one of only 2 state psychiatric hospitals that treat felony patients. Described as fortress-like, it is adjacent to the Manhattan Psychiatric Center and houses more than 200 patients, including those deemed criminally insane. Here, Daniel would be housed among many other convicted defendants granted an insanity plea. A couple of years passed and a sudden twist in the tale emerged. The police apprehended Randy Easterday in connection with the killing. Daniel seized the opportunity to share his perspective with the newspaper, painting Randy as a sinister figure engaged in dark rituals and occult practices. In the interview, Daniel alleged that Randy's involvement in Monica's murder was part of a satanic ritual. He pondered aloud whether he had conspired to offer Monica's body as a sacrifice to the devil. Predictably, Randy denied these accusations, dismissing them as desperate attempts by Daniel to shift blame and evade justice. Nevertheless, Randy found himself behind bars for 2 months as the investigation unfolded. However, the district attorney ultimately conceded that there wasn't enough concrete evidence to sustain the charges against Randy. One crucial witness was deemed unreliable, casting doubt on the validity of the case against him. With insufficient evidence to proceed, Randy was released from custody. Meanwhile, Daniel was petitioning for a transfer to a non-forensic hospital. This would be a step towards potential placement in a halfway house, a gateway to an eventual release. The medical reports painted a picture of a compliant, non-violent individual who had never once been restrained or isolated for misconduct. However, Daniel's persistent refusal to accept antipsychotic medication raised concerns. The court concluded that while Daniel had shown improvement, it was within the highly structured confines of a secure psychiatric institution. They stated, quote, "His improvement does not establish that he no longer poses a danger to himself or to others should he be placed in an unsecured facility." In 2010, Daniel's situation was reviewed yet again. The verdict showed progress. He was no longer considered dangerous, but Daniel still did not accept the reality of his condition and continued to refuse medication. Though no longer seen as a threat, Daniel's mental health diagnosis meant he would continue to live within the walls of Kirby Forensic Psychiatric Hospital. As of 2020, the latest update on Daniel's story comes from the more curious corners of the internet. A true crime collectible website was selling a letter supposedly written by Daniel himself. This website, known for trading in the macabre and unusual, offered items ranging from used sugar packets to autographed handprints, and even more peculiar memorabilia crafted from the prints of various body parts. Just use your imagination. This letter is marked as originating from zip code 10035, Ward's Island. The letter says he's in a facility, though it doesn't specify if it's Kirby or the adjacent non-forensic hospital. Daniel complains that he misses his pets and the company of women. He says that he passes the time playing Magic the Gathering.
We have seen that Satanism can be linked to dope and to pornography, child abuse, and to murder. It has led seemingly normal teenagers into monstrous behavior.
The 1980s were a decade of big hair, bright outfits, and unique music. But beneath its neon colors and loud fashion statements, there was a fever brewing. Later known as the Satanic Panic, it was a phenomena that seeped into the very psyche of a nation, creating a torrent of sensational charges and moral uproar. Powerful media personalities like Geraldo Rivera and Oprah Winfrey had tremendous influence on public sentiment during this period. Their talk shows, characterized by dramatic tales and emotionally charged interviews, ushered the Satanic Panic right into the heart of American homes, giving it a sense of urgency.
I'm going to say this as straight as I possibly can. I am begging you, if you're a parent and you've got kids there, that this subject is just too upsetting for your young children. Please get them out of the room or change the station.
One of the things caught up in this whirlwind of fear was the heavy metal music genre. Bands like Black Sabbath, Iron Maiden, and Judas Priest came under intense scrutiny. Their lyrics, characterized by rebellious and sometimes dark themes, became the subject of widespread concern. The fear stemmed from suspicions that these songs were embedded with subliminal messages that promoted satanic worship. As a result, heavy metal music was labeled as a moral hazard, fueling the hysteria that was already raging. Amid this escalating panic, many parents succumbed to the belief that satanic cults were lurking in the most unassuming corners. A place called Azteca Woods in Northport, New York was one of them. Northport is a historic maritime village on Long Island's North Shore. It was first settled by English Puritans in the 17th century, who feared and hated anything perceived to be related to witchcraft. In the early 20th century, some people believed that the town had a link to Aleister Crowley, a notorious occultist and magician who lived in New York for a while. In the 1970s, a witchcraft museum opened in the town, and stories circulated of rituals taking place in the woods. There was a weird abandoned building there, with stone floors and arches. Was it an old church? A half-built orphanage? The local teens didn't care. They thought it was the ideal place to party, deep in the woods where no one would bother them. Richard Kasso Jr. was born on March 29, 1967, the only boy in a family of 4 children. His father was a teacher and a coach who wanted his kids to love sports as much as he did. His mother was a homemaker who cared for Ricky and his 3 sisters. Ricky's childhood seemed normal at first, but when he was in the 8th grade, he rebelled. He would sneak off after football practice and smoke pot. He made friends with the wrong crowd and got into trouble at school. He rejected the jock culture and was a self-proclaimed dirtbag. He even broke into a neighbor's house with his buddies, but they got caught. His parents then found out about his drug habit and sent him to counseling. But Ricky didn't care. He kept doing drugs, especially mescaline. He showed up to his counseling sessions high. He skipped school, got into fights, and had run-ins with the cops. He was on a very different path than his family had hoped for him. Ricky's parents tried different ways to help him with his drug and mental problems, but none of them worked. First, they considered sending him to a special school for adolescents with substance abuse and behavioral issues. However, Ricky skipped the interview and ran away for 2 weeks. Then they sought help from South Oaks, a local facility that offered drug rehabilitation and mental health services for troubled youth in the 80s. A court decision sent Ricky, who was 15 years old, to this institution. There, he was labeled as emotionally handicapped, drug dependent, and antisocial. He was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and prescribed lithium, but he often escaped from the facility and eventually dropped out of school. After that, Ricky's path continued downhill as he embraced the street life. His parents were left wondering as months would pass by without any sign of him. He slept at friends' houses or built makeshift shelters deep in Azteca Woods. Ricky used various drugs such as LSD, mescaline, and PCP. But drugs were not the only thing that changed him.
No, 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 no. This is serious. Serious. We could make you delirious. Delirious. You should have a healthy fear of us. Fear of us. Too much of us is dangerous.
He also became interested in the occult and the mystical. He started to mix his hallucinations with his beliefs. The line between reality and the supernatural began to blur. Ricky liked to read books that were dark and creepy, such as the Necronomicon and the Satanic Bible. He would drop acid in Azteca and watch the trees move and talk to him. He thought he could hear spirits in their whispers. He listened to music by Ozzy Osbourne and Iron Maiden. He also wrote his own songs that he played on the guitar for his friends. One of Ricky's compositions went like this. Ricky was proud of his new spiritual path, and he let everyone know it. He would walk around town, chanting in Latin and telling stories of animal sacrifices. He would get high and wander around in Azteca, shouting, "I am Satan." Many ignored him, knowing that he liked to shock and scare people. And he was on PCP more often than not. But was he really a Satanist, or was he just a troubled teen with mental illness and addiction? One night in April 1984, the police found Ricky Kasso in a strange place. He was in an old cemetery, digging up a grave. He was trying to remove a body from the ground. The police searched him and found a paper in his pocket. It had a list of names. Lucifer, also known as Satan, the leader of hell, who represents evil and rebellion against God. Mammon, a demon who tempts people with greed and money. Asmodeus, a demon who is linked to lust, sin, and desire. Beelzebub, a demon who is called the Lord of the Flies, referring to decay, disease, and corruption. This made the scene even more disturbing. The police asked him what he was doing in the cemetery. He claimed he was a Satanist and he wanted to use the body for a dark ritual. They didn't find any proof that he took anything from the grave, so they only charged him with a minor crime for breaking public health rules. They gave him a court date, and they let him go. Gary Lauwers had a hard life growing up. He tried to fit in, but nothing seemed to work. His father was a banker who gave his kids nice things. But when Gary wore a shirt and blazer to school, the other kids made fun of him. They called him names and said he must be gay for wearing clothes like that. Gary had to deal with a lot of hate, and he needed a way to cope. Gary found an escape and a place to belong with marijuana. He smoked with other misfits who didn't judge him. But Gary didn't know at the time that this would lead him to cross paths with Ricky Kasso. Gary ran away from home so many times that his parents gave up on calling the cops. He was caught up in a wild life of crime and drugs. He and his friend Jimmy had a way of making money by stealing from boats and cars. They waited for the snow to come, because then they could sneak into the boats that were docked for the winter. They also broke into cars and took whatever they could find inside. They used the money to buy drugs and booze. Ricky sold LSD and PCP to everyone, and Gary was one of his best customers. But one night at a party, Gary did something stupid. He stole 10 bags of PCP from Ricky's pocket when he was asleep. Someone saw him do it and told Ricky. Ricky was very angry and gave Gary a deadline: pay him back in 2 weeks or else. But Gary got lucky when Ricky got sick with pneumonia and had to go to the hospital. But that luck didn't last long. Ricky's mother wanted him to be placed in the psychiatric ward once he recovered physically. During the psychiatric evaluation, the doctors learned about Ricky's criminal charges and drug use. Ricky even told them that he would end his own life rather than go to jail. This only made the doctors suspicious, thinking he might be manipulating the situation to gain sympathy in family court. The hospital released him, saying that he did not exhibit acute psychosis, hallucinations, or delusions. They didn't know that they were making a big mistake. They didn't know that they were letting a killer go free. They didn't know that they were putting Gary in great danger. Ricky was furious when he saw Gary again. He attacked him and demanded his money back. Gary only had $30, which wasn't enough. Ricky warned him that he would come back for more soon. Gary was scared and bought a knife to defend himself. He stayed inside and tried to avoid Ricky for a few weeks. One day, Ricky showed up at Gary's door without warning. Gary's mother tried to defuse the situation. She gave Ricky $50 and asked him to forgive Gary. She hoped that they could just be friends again. Ricky seemed to agree and left peacefully, but he was still angry inside. He felt betrayed by Gary's theft. It wasn't just about the money. He wanted revenge. A few weeks later, Gary and Ricky ended up at the same party. Gary went up to Ricky and tried to give him some money, but Ricky didn't take it. He gave Gary some drugs instead. They decided to get some donuts and go hang out in Azteca Woods. Ricky Kasso, Gary Lauer, Jimmy Troiano, and Albert Canones went into the forest, but Gary never came back out. The morning after, Ricky was back getting high just like every other day. Jimmy and Albert had seen firsthand how far Ricky could go and didn't want to get on his bad side, so they were laying low and keeping quiet. Plus, since Gary often ran away from home, maybe nobody would notice he was missing for a while. But Ricky wasn't shy about what he'd done. He made sure other people knew all about it. It was his way of sending a message. If you mess with Ricky Kasso, you're messing with the devil. Gary's disappearance did not go unnoticed by his probation officer, who realized he had not checked in for a while. There were rumors he had skipped town, but surprisingly, no one reported him missing and no one looked for him. His body lay rotting in the woods for weeks until someone anonymously tipped off the police. Meanwhile, Ricky and Jimmy bought a cheap car in New Jersey and planned to go to California. They had a stash of drugs they wanted to sell to finance the trip, and on Long Island they had lots of buyers. So they drove back to New York, not knowing that the police had found Gary's body, and that they had identified Ricky, Jimmy, and Albert as the main suspects in his murder. Albert Canonis was the first one to be caught by the police. He quickly blamed Ricky and Jimmy for the murder. He said that Jimmy had started a fight over the drugs Gary stole and urged Ricky to cut Gary's throat. He told the police that Ricky had made Gary kneel down and had stabbed him over and over, shouting, "Say you love Satan." Gary's only words were, "I love you, Mom." In Jimmy's statement to the police, he initially admitted to being part of the murder, saying that he knew Gary had to die or he would rat them out if he lived, and that he didn't care because Gary had stolen from Ricky. He said he kicked Gary, breaking his ribs, and then held him while Ricky stabbed him. He said, quote, "Ricky was talking some shit about Satan over Gary's body. He's into stuff about Satan and the devil. I saw Gary move his head slightly, and Ricky bugged out and started stabbing Gary in the face. I don't know how many times, but it was a lot," end quote. He revised his statement several times and was assisting the police by going back to the crime scene to give authorities more details. Ricky admitted to the murder right away. He said that he, Jimmy, and Albert had talked about killing Gary earlier that night. Ricky told the police that he had stabbed Gary many times while Jimmy held him down. He said that he and Jimmy dragged Gary deeper into the woods and started to bury him, thinking he was dead. When Gary suddenly got up, Ricky freaked out and stabbed him multiple times in the face. Ricky said, quote, "I heard a crow caw, which is a sign of the devil. I knew then that Gary was dead." All three of them were charged with murder and held without bail pending a hearing the following week. But Ricky never faced a jury for the murder of Gary Lauwers. On July 7, 1984, he died after hanging himself with a sheet in his cell. Albert Canonis agreed to testify against Jimmy in exchange for immunity, but it wasn't as open and shut as you might think. Ricky's statement to police was not admissible in court. Under the Sixth Amendment of the United States Constitution, as well as the right to a speedy trial and an impartial jury, a person has the right to be, quote, confronted with the witnesses against him, end quote. Many confrontation clause cases have gone to the Supreme Court, and through the years they have held to interpreting the Sixth Amendment literally. A statement made outside a court of law, meaning not under oath, is hearsay and therefore not admissible. On the stand, Jimmy recanted his earlier statements. He testified he had gaps in his memory due to the large amount of drugs he was on that night, and that the police had prompted him to fill in the blanks. Albert's testimony was called into question for the same reason. The statements of those high on hallucinogens were unreliable, which was enough to cast reasonable doubt, and the jury returned a not guilty verdict. Jimmy Troiano was acquitted of second-degree murder. Albert Canonis wrote a book only 2 months ago about his experience. He says he is haunted by the deaths and always asks himself if he could have done something different. He claims police beat him and forced him to sign a false statement. He also criticizes the media for sensationalizing the satanic cult angle. Only 18 miles from New York City, Old Westbury blends the best of both worlds, a serene and idyllic community with easy access to the lively city life. it also has the lowest crime rate of any county in the whole of the United States. May 29, 1982 was Memorial Day weekend, and the air was filled with anticipation and excitement. This holiday marks the unofficial start of summer. It means different things to different people, but for most, it's a chance to relax, have fun, and enjoy the warm weather. For Thomas, it meant throwing a party for his old friends from high school. He had just finished his semester at college and was back home for the summer. He wanted to catch up with his friends, share stories, and maybe meet some new girls. For 16-year-old Rory, it meant getting some food. He just finished work and was starving. He decided to stop by the diner for a quick bite before heading home. For Lauren, it meant starting a new job. She was 17 years old, and this was her very first job. She was nervous but excited to start earning a little pocket money of her own. She put on her uniform, grabbed her purse, and headed out the door. For old friends Rita and Karen, it meant having a girls' night out. They decided to meet at their usual place to grab a late-night meal. For Ishak, it meant another night of driving around town in his cab. He immigrated from Pakistan with his father and brothers, and he went into the taxi industry with them. He had just dropped off a fare nearby and decided to stop by the diner for a cup of coffee. When he parked his cab outside, he saw that it was crowded, but he was tired and really needed a boost, so he entered the diner to find a seat. But the story really begins 5 days earlier, on May 25th, when Annelle Kennedy, 18, drove to pick up her boyfriend Michael Williams and his 4 friends. They were James Martin, Robert Samuels, Bruce Garrison, and Aubrey Rawlings, all aged between 19 and 22. They came from a poor and crime-ridden neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York, one of the 5 boroughs of New York City. In the 80s, Brooklyn had more than 25% of its residents living in poverty and faced high rates of violence. Most of the friends had dropped out of high school, grew up with single parents, and some even had children of their own. Robert, only 19, already had a criminal record for burglary and larceny. The group had a daring plan to rob a diner in Jericho, another wealthy town in Nassau County. They drove there from Brooklyn, crossing the border between 2 very different worlds. While Brooklyn had many people struggling with poverty and crime, Jericho had less than 5% of its population living below the poverty line and a much lower crime rate. The robbers hoped to find rich and easy targets carrying cash and jewelry. The group arrived at the Jericho Townhouse, a popular diner serving breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They quickly overpowered the employees and patrons and forced them to lie on the floor. They went from table to table, grabbing wallets, purses, watches, rings, and necklaces. Some of the customers tried to resist or plead with them, but they were met with punches and threats. The robbers collected over $37,000 in cash and jewelry. They then confronted the owner, and one of the men shot at him. The gun misfired twice, making loud clicking noises. The owner looked at them with disbelief and fear. The robber got angry and hit him on the head with the gun. After a 45-minute ordeal, the group ran out of the diner, leaving behind a scene of chaos and terror. They got into their car and sped away, thinking they had pulled off a perfect heist. The group was exhilarated by the success of their first robbery. They couldn't believe how easy it was to get away with thousands of dollars in cash and valuables. They felt like they had found a gold mine in Nassau County, where the people were rich and unsuspecting. Michael decided to recruit his younger brother Robert, who was eager to join in on the action. Aubrey and Michael's girlfriend weren't with them on the night of May 29th, when the group decided to continue their crime spree. The group ended up in Plainview, a couple of towns east from the diner they robbed 5 days prior. They decided that the Plainview Diner was too well lit and had too many windows facing the street, so they moved on. In the nearby residential areas, they spotted a large house with a lot of cars parked out front. They figured it was a party and there'd be lots of people inside. They casually approached the house and ran into a couple who were just leaving. Pointing a gun at them, they demanded details about what was going on inside and who was there. They forced the couple back inside and went downstairs to the den where Thomas and his college friends were gathered. They forced everyone to strip and lie naked on the floor, then woke up Thomas's parents. They interrogated the parents about where all the valuables and electronics were located. They collected everyone's cash and jewelry on top of that. They were ecstatic with their haul. They also decided to terrorize and humiliate their hostages, especially the women. They assaulted the women, taking some of them into another room to violate them. They laughed and mocked the victims, calling them names and beating them with the gun and a blackjack. A blackjack is like a club or paddle, with one end weighted, usually with lead or other heavy objects like coins. In a final act of cruel indignity, they urinated on the victims before finally leaving the home. But they weren't even done yet, not by a long shot. Heading back west, towards Brooklyn, they spotted a pair of restaurants in Old Westbury, the Red Coach Grill and the Seacrest Diner. They chose the diner, which was less crowded and had what they called church windows, stained glass that was almost impossible to see through from outside. It was shortly after 1 a.m. when the group of men entered the diner, beginning the final act of one of the most horrible and traumatic crimes that county has ever experienced. Once inside, they ordered everyone down on the floor, telling them not to look at their faces or they would kill them, and telling everyone to remove their jewelry and their clothing. Rita and Karen clung to each other, one of the men kicking Karen when she failed to remove her earrings. The men demanded that anyone who had a gun hand it over. Tony, the night manager, and a retired police officer were among those who had their firearms taken. They randomly pistol whipped and beat the patrons with the blackjack, including Ishak the cab driver, who was knocked unconscious. They fired a shotgun into the pile of people, and the pellets hit 16-year-old Rory and one other person in the buttocks. As they did just a couple of hours earlier, the men assaulted some of the women and took others to the far end of the dining area to violate them. And if that wasn't horrible and degrading enough, they told the rest of the patrons to commit sex acts on one another while they watched. When it was all over, the diner gang left behind over 100 people traumatized by one of the most disturbing crimes that area had ever witnessed. 3 of the men were arrested the following day when the police spotted the stolen car. They discovered evidence in the vehicle that linked the men back to the robbery on the 25th. All of the participants were eventually caught and arrested. Ishak played a big role in apprehending the men. He was able to pick them out of a lineup so quickly it surprised the police. He credits being a cabbie for his talent for remembering faces. Annelle Kennedy and Aubrey Rawlings faced charges related to the Jericho Diner incident on the 25th. Michael's brother, Robert Williams, faced charges for his role in the car theft, Plainview House, and Seacrest Diner crimes. And Michael Williams, James Martin, Robert Samuels, and Bruce Garrison all faced charges related to all of the incidents, dubbed the Diner Spree. The charges included sodomy, assault, sexual assault, burglary, robbery, and attempted murder. Annelle Kennedy was found guilty of 7 counts of robbery and 1 count of assault, and sentenced to 7 to 21 years in prison. She was paroled after serving 5 years. Aubrey Rawlings was found guilty of 3 counts of robbery and 1 firearms charge, and was sentenced to 15 to 30 years in prison. He was paroled after serving 21 years. Michael and Robert Williams, James Martin, Robert Samuels, and Bruce Garrison were all found guilty of a total of 817 felonies. If served consecutively, they would have to serve 3,797 to 4,054 years in prison. At that time, the law did not allow them to serve their sentences consecutively, so each man received the maximum sentence of 15 to 30 years. A proposed amendment that would have enabled consecutive sentences for certain felonies and given judges more discretion in sentencing based on the number and severity of the crimes failed to pass the state legislature. Even if it had passed, it would not have applied retroactively to their trials. A similar amendment has since been enacted in recent years. The amendment aims to deter and punish the most serious and violent offenders in the state. Robert Samuels and James Martin received life sentences for another murder that the police uncovered during the probe. Bruce Garrison and Michael Williams spent the full 30 years behind bars. Robert Williams got out after serving 20 years because he took part in all the rehabilitation programs. All of the convicts are in their 60s now. Rory suffered a serious injury that required a colostomy, a surgery that creates an opening in the abdomen for waste to pass into a bag. This was done to let his wounded bowels heal. One waitress never returned to work or collected her last paycheck. Ishak struggled with migraines and insomnia. All of the victims were deeply scarred by the ordeal. Since all the men pleaded guilty, everyone was relieved that they didn't have to testify and relive their nightmares, but they also felt outraged by the sentence. They thought it was too lenient for such a heinous crime. The law changed in 1993 to increase the maximum consecutive sentence from 15 to 30 years to 25 to 50 years.
Everyone wanted to know how we didn't find her. I'm thinking, how do we defend this? But it was easy to defend because when anyone saw a video of what he had done and what he had created and the steps that you had to take to get down into this dungeon, everyone understood how you would not find it.
Katie Beers was born on December 30th, 1982, in West Islip, New York. Her mother, Marilyn, had a one-night stand and, as a result, Katie's biological father was not known. Katie and her half-brother John grew up in a neglectful environment which was unstable and chaotic. When Katie was a baby, Marilyn often left her and her brother with their godparents, Linda and Sal Ingaleri. For several years, she bounced from town to town, living with her mother, grandmother, and the Ingaleris, whom she called her aunt and uncle. Katie endured horrible conditions no matter where she went. Her grandmother could not afford to care for her, and when she was at her mother's house, she would sleep on a mattress on the floor, surrounded by garbage. Sal and Linda treated Katie like a slave. Linda had her constantly doing chores and running errands instead of doing homework or playing outside like the other kids. Sal would physically abuse her and force her to endure unspeakable acts. She frequently missed school and stopped going altogether after being sent home several times for head lice. The school then filed an educational neglect charge, an action that automatically started a Child Protective Services investigation. CPS supposedly invested the situation over a period of years with no action taken. Neighbors said that one time Linda chased the CPS caseworker away, screaming at them. John Esposito was born on May 19, 1940. He was only 3 pounds, and the doctors didn't expect him to survive. From the descriptions of him as a child and young adult, it's likely that he was on the autism spectrum or developmentally disabled. As an adult, he didn't really act his age. He had video games in his home, a pool in his backyard, and a basketball hoop in his driveway. John Esposito was very fond of children, particularly young boys. He once tried to lure a little boy into his car, but the boy started to cry and Esposito got scared and left. A month later, he was arrested because the security guards recognized him from the previous incident. He told the police that he was, quote, just looking for a friend. He pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor charge of unlawful imprisonment. He had never been in trouble before, so the record was sealed, and he never told anyone about it. He soon found another way to get close to children. He joined a Catholic charity Big Brother program. He was assigned to mentor little brothers, boys who were 10 to 12 years old. This was in the 70s and 80s, when the charity did not screen the volunteers very carefully. He also befriended the boys in his neighborhood. His apartment was described as a toy store, candy store, and amusement park, all in one. Most parents had no problem with John hanging out with their children. He was a well-known figure in the community. He worked in construction, so he often helped people with their home projects. He was always ready to lend a hand, whether it was carrying groceries or shoveling snow. They thought he was a good man, doing charity work and taking care of his little brothers. He liked to spoil the kids with presents and fun activities. He would bring them to arcades, baseball games, movies, and carnivals. He would buy them toys and electronics and welcome them to his family events like barbecues or Christmas dinner. Esposito seemed to be a caring and generous friend to the boys. The kids and their parents trusted him and would later even defend him. His little brothers insisted that he was not a bad person and that he had never touched them inappropriately or made them feel uncomfortable. In 1984, John Beers became Esposito's little brother. For years, he and John Beers spent many weekends together. As he had done with the other boys, Esposito would shower John with gifts and take him places. They spent so much time together, everyone started calling them Big John and Little John. John alleges that when he was 12, Esposito told him that he was getting too old and that Esposito needed to find another little brother. By then, the Catholic charity was no longer running a Big Brother program. Esposito applied to a different program, but he was turned down when he lied about his past arrest. He kept seeing John Beers, but was still searching for another little brother. He posted ads and flyers which read, "If you have a son who you think needs a man's influence, I may be able to volunteer my time." But no one responded. He came across Anthony Frey, a boy of 8 from a troubled family, who was acquainted with the Beers. Anthony would sometimes have his little sister tag along, and John sometimes brought his little sister, Katie. It was late December of 1992, and just a couple of days before Katie's 10th birthday. Esposito had a special present for her, a Barbie dream house. With a hefty cost of $170, this toy was a luxury item in its time. Inflation makes that amount equal to $365 today. He returned the next day to put the toy together and suggested to Aunt Linda that he take her out for her birthday to a giant arcade called Spaceplex. Esposito would always take his little brothers there, so this wasn't an unusual request, and Linda had no problem with it. Katie never made it back home after her trip to Spaceplex. Later that day, Linda heard a terrifying message from Katie on her answering machine. She had missed the call by only seconds. "Help me, a man with a knife took me. Oh no, he's coming back." John Esposito called shortly after, sobbing uncontrollably. He claimed that he left Katie for a moment to get some arcade tokens and that when he came back, she was gone. Katie's family trusted him, but the police had doubts. They treated Esposito as a suspect from the start. If you're wondering how adults could let kids roam around arcades without supervision or spend hours playing video games at someone's house, you should know that parenting was different back then. Parents were hands-off, giving kids more freedom to explore the world on their own and to deal with the positive and negative consequences of their choices. The police often assumed that a missing child was a runaway rather than a victim of foul play. But the voicemail made Katie's case different. It made the police act fast. Esposito was eager to cooperate with the police. He told authorities what they had done that day. Toys R Us, where he bought Katie a troll doll and a Nintendo game. 7-Eleven for a Slurpee, and Spaceplex, where he gave her $5 for tokens, expecting her to come right back. Panicking, he looked everywhere for her. The police questioned him for hours, and he finally hired a lawyer. To address the public scrutiny, he attended a press conference and, with his lawyers beside him, faced the media. He repeated his story and cried as he said, "I just want to do everything I can to find her." The FBI was called in to analyze the message on Linda's answering machine. They noticed it was completely silent in the background. They expected to hear some traffic sounds if the call was made from a gas station on a busy highway. They suspected that the message was pre-recorded and played back through the payphone. This made the investigation more difficult and brought them no closer to finding Katie. A psychic offered her services to the police, and a local radio station created a song to try to raise awareness. The case of her disappearance was even featured on America's Most Wanted, and dozens of tips poured in. However, none of them led to any breakthroughs. The police were running out of leads and time. But John Esposito had been hiding a dark secret. He used his construction job as a cover, so no one ever suspected anything odd about his home improvement projects. Under the rug in his office closet, behind a bookcase, there was a hidden hole under a thick slab of concrete. It led to a tunnel that connected to two tiny rooms with thick concrete walls. The first room had a security monitor and a makeshift toilet. He had installed various types of restraints into the room. In the second, smaller room, there was a little TV on a narrow shelf, and a metal collar was attached to the wall with a chain. There was a thin mattress with a pillow and blankets, and a girl's nightgown on it. He had been preparing this place for Katie for a long time. He had soundproofed the walls so no one would hear her scream. John had deceived Katie about going to Spaceplex. They did get a Slurpee and a video game from Toys R Us, but instead of the arcade, he took her to his house. He said she could try the new game out on his Nintendo. While she was playing the game, he snatched her from behind and dragged her downstairs. He yanked the bookcase and it opened to show the secret space behind. He raised the slab, threw her into the hole, and made her crawl through the tunnel. He led her through the room with the toilet and pushed her into the smaller room. She describes it as the size of a coffin. He soon followed, carrying more blankets, some candy and soda, and a tape recorder. He told her exactly what to say and left her alone to practice. When he listened to the recordings afterwards, he heard her whisper softly at the end, "Big John took me. He has me at his house." He was furious and slapped her, hard. He told her to record the message again while he supervised. He said he was going to use the recording to make everyone believe she was abducted or dead. He said he was going to keep her there forever, and soon everyone would give up and stop searching for her. He grabbed the tape recorder and left her alone in the coffin-sized room, securing the door behind him. She didn't know until years later that he hid the tape recorder somewhere in the larger room and set it to voice-activated mode. She screamed, but no one came. She battered the small door with her feet until it flew open. She looked around the bigger room with the toilet and security monitor. The monitor was connected to a camera pointed at John's driveway, towards the street so that he would be able to see if anyone came to the house. She found a key next to the security monitor, so she took it, later hiding it under her pillow. She also saw something that deepened her fear. There were chains attached to the wall and a strange-looking box. A box with a hole on one side, a lock, and had foam inside. It was a head box. It's believed that Esposito got the idea for the head box from a book that he read. Perfect Victim, The True Story of the Girl in the Box, was a book written about a woman named Colleen Stan, who was abducted and tortured over the span of 7 years. She would be locked up for 23 hours a day, and her head was locked in a box lined with carpet. If you'd like to hear more about that story, check out Daniel Rakowitz video on the case. I'll leave a link in the description below. Satisfied with the recording, John left and went to Spaceplex to put his plan into action. He dialed Linda from the payphone and played the tape he had forced Katie to make. Then he rushed into the arcade, pretended to be frantic, and told staff he had lost Katie in the crowd. He begged them to call the police and report her missing. In the days that followed, Katie would endure unimaginable horrors. She was chained by her neck, but she had the hidden key and was able to secretly unlock herself. Since she was not able to reach the toilet in the other room with the neck chain on, she had to relieve herself at the end of the bed so that she didn't alert Esposito that she was unlocking herself. Big John visited her often, bringing her food, blankets, and toys. But he also hurt her, touching her in ways that made her feel sick and scared, doing the same things that Uncle Sal used to do to her. He told her that she would never leave him, she was his forever. He became someone else, someone sadistic and cruel. She learned to dread the blank look in his eyes. That meant he was going to hurt her again. Esposito had Katie test the bunker by making her scream and make noise, while checking every room in his house for any sound. He was confident that his secret was safe and that no one would ever find Katie. When the police showed up, he acted surprised and innocent and invited them in. He let them search, confident they would find nothing. Meanwhile, Katie saw the police on the TV screen in the bunker. She screamed for help, hoping they would hear her, but no one heard her. The soundproofing worked too well. The cops left, and Katie cried. She begged to be let go, but John always said no. He said he loved her and that they could have a family together one day, that he would take care of her for the rest of her life. There were no windows, so she had no sense of time. All the days blurred together like a nightmare that never ended. She watched the little TV and saw herself on the news. She tried as hard as she could not to sleep, afraid that John might come back to hurt her, or worse, kill her. One day she heard John coming, but it wasn't the usual time. The 6 o'clock news wasn't on the TV. It was the morning of January 13th, 1993, and John wasn't alone this time. She saw 2 men in suits behind John, and one of them said softly, "You can come out now, Katie." She was unsure if they were lying or not. They claimed they were cops, and she followed them through the tunnel, suspicious but hopeful. When she reached the hole, she looked up and saw an officer, this one in uniform, who reached down to pull her out. Earlier, John had gathered his family at his lawyer's office to reveal that he knew where Katie was. The lawyers then notified the police, but only after alerting the local news media. As Katie was led from her former prison, she was met with a swarm of cameras and questions. At the police station, she was provided with a fresh set of clothes and some food as they questioned her for hours on end. After the interview, they brought her to the hospital for a thorough evaluation to assess the extent of her injuries. She slept for a long time, and the next morning, a nurse told her she had to stay in the hospital for a few more days and that she must keep the drapes shut, even in the daytime. What the nurse didn't tell Katie was that there were hordes of media camped outside, eager to get a glimpse of her. She had survived a horrific ordeal, and everyone wanted to hear her story. Soon, a CPS caseworker informed Katie she wouldn't be going home. Katie couldn't comprehend why she was being separated from her mother and brother, who were the only people she thought of as safe. She didn't really understand at the time that her mother really wasn't fit to care for her. A plan was made to get Katie out from the hospital without the media seeing her. Katie laid very still on a gurney with a sheet over her whole body until they reached a car where she climbed in. They didn't tell her where she was going, and after what seemed like an eternity, they arrived at a big house in a suburban neighborhood. They told her that this was her new foster family and that they would take good care of her. She looked at the strangers who were supposed to be her new mom and dad and felt a surge of panic. It didn't even feel real, more like she was on the set of a TV show. Her foster parents didn't hesitate to enroll her in school and tried everything to make her feel welcome. But she missed her mother, and she was still scared. The kids at her new school had been told about her situation, but she wished they hadn't. She was behind in school and had to be tutored to catch up. She had been neglected for so long that it was strange for her to have things like regular doctor checkups or to be asked how she was doing or feeling. She was in therapy for a very long time. She had to recount a lot of bad memories to prepare for the coming criminal cases. John Esposito was charged with first-degree kidnapping and 6 counts of child abuse. Katie bravely took the stand to testify. Due to the overwhelming evidence, Esposito took a plea deal, agreeing to plead guilty to first-degree kidnapping in exchange for dropping the child abuse charges. Katie said, quote, "He made me feel dirty. I didn't know what he was going to do to me. Even though now I am safe, I still worry all the time. I worry about being taken away. I worry that someone might hurt me. John Esposito should go to jail for as long as he can."
She begged you to let her go. Yes, refused to tell you. After 4 or 5 days.
The proceedings were closed from the media because the judge had received a note from Katie. Sal Inghileri's actions were discovered during the kidnapping investigation, and he was also charged with several counts of child abuse. During the trial, he tried to intimidate Katie and said her failure to look him in the eyes was because she was lying. Katie eventually asked the judge to, quote, "make him stop looking at me that way." But when it was time to give her testimony, she was confident, describing the hardships she endured living with her godparents and how Sal had forced her to do unspeakable things. FBI experts said the underground bunker was very sophisticated and was the result of very careful planning. That in fact it was so well constructed that had Esposito not come forward, it was likely they would have never found Katie. The dungeon was eventually excavated and it shocked authorities. The public had a morbid curiosity to learn more about the case. The neighbors even charged admission into their backyard so that people could view the excavation process. Some parents even took their kids to the scene, using it to reinforce the idea that it wasn't just stranger danger, child abusers could look normal and live right next door. But there was a campaign to pressure the media into leaving Katie alone, allowing her to try to live a normal life without cameras and microphones in her face all the time. It was actually successful, and Katie was given the space to heal and grow up. John Esposito was sentenced to 15 years to life and sent to Sing Sing prison. This is one of the oldest prisons in the U.S., constructed in 1824. It also housed the only execution chamber for the state of New York until capital punishment was abolished. It's where the term Old Sparky originated, referring to the electric chair. He would face the parole board 4 times, being denied every time. Shortly after the 4th hearing in 2013, he was discovered dead in his cell. It was determined he died of natural causes due to underlying heart disease. Megan's Law was enacted in 1996 and requires sex offenders to notify authorities before moving to a new area and to provide details of the new location so the resulting database can be available to the public. This law was named after Megan Nicole Conca, a 7-year-old girl who was murdered by a convicted child abuser who had recently moved to the area where she lived. Sal Inghileri served 12 years in prison, and after his release in 2006, he violated Megan's Law and was sent back to jail. In 2009, he collapsed and refused treatment by the correctional facility. He went into cardiac arrest and was revived and transported to a hospital where he was pronounced dead. Though there was a custody battle, Katie Beers remained with her foster parents until adulthood. She remains in contact with her mother, Marilyn, but they don't have a close relationship. She is now married with 2 children of her own. The same year that John Esposito died in prison, Katie co-authored a book about her ordeal called Buried Memories. She said the book helped her heal from the trauma, and the fact that both of her abusers are now deceased has given her some form of closure. A 10-year-old Katie gives us this advice. If another little girl or boy were kidnapped or abused, I would advise them to talk to an adult or go to the police. They should talk about everything with their therapist if they have one, and they should try to be brave. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing for more. As always, you can share your opinions or suggestions in the comments. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for our next video, where we'll explore another story hidden within the wrinkles in crime.